Am I visible here? Good evening, everybody, and welcome to St. George's Talks, a monthly series of lectures on subjects pertaining to this wonderful building and the Lutherans, the German Lutherans who built it in the 18th century. Guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren, und willkommen in St. Georg's Vorträge. That's the extent of the German I'll do this evening. It just makes a little connection with the past, giving a brief welcome in German. Welcome everybody who is both online and here in the church. To you online, it's best if you mute. To you in the church here, I am obliged to point out that in extremis, the exits are the door you came in through and an equivalent on the other side of the church. And that there are toilets here at the back of the church, also near the entrance you came in, or actually toilet. It's singular and unigender. My name's Rick Jones. I'm the chair of the committee of the Friends who are responsible for staging the events of a secular nature which happen here. And those include book launches, a wedding sometimes, these talks, visits by groups, and on each first Saturday of the month, an organ vespers with a visiting guest recitalist. You may notice at the benefactors board at the back of the church, the King of Prussia gave us 50 quid in 1884, which went some way to paying for the newly installed and unique organ in this building, made by Walker in Germany. Our speaker for this evening's talk, 10 Moments That Shaped Berlin, is German history professor at University College London, UCL, the capital's most ancient uni, celebrating this year its 200th anniversary. In fact, in 1826, the noisy, filthy, greedy, and polluted city was thought by some as inappropriate to rival Oxbridge, and Punch magazine, the satirical publication of its day, referred to it as the Joint Stock Cockney Learning Company. But over time, the UCL has proved itself a world-class institution able to attract the finest academic brains among the staff. Our speaker was the head of German there for 12 years, Dean of Social Sciences, a graduate of Cambridge and of Harvard universities, has served as chair of the Modern History section of the British Academy and chair of the German History Society, and published as the editor or author 29 books, one of which, I've told myself to hold up the book here, shares its title with the talk. We don't have copies of this book available for sale this evening, but what we do have is a form which you may take a picture of with your mobile phone, which will enable you to buy the book and have it sent to you at a discount price of 20% from the original, which is very good value. And it's a marvelous book. There are many other attributes, but that's just to use up time, which you may have for questions at the end. So will you welcome, please, our speaker this evening, who's going to talk about the shaping of Berlin, Professor Mary Fulbrook.
Thank you very much. I've been issued with a little stool so that I can stand a bit higher, but so bear with me if I fall off it. Okay, easier to see you from there.
Shall I just start the screen share?
You can start the screen share. Yeah. I should say it's really nice to be in a German Lutheran church. It sort of makes me feel a little bit like I'm going on holiday or being somewhere completely different, far away from central London. Okay, are we good to go?
I think so.
Good. So Cambridge University Press sent an email saying they were commissioning a series of books called 10 Moments That Shaped, and then the name of a city, so Tokyo, Rome, etc., etc. And it took me all of 20 seconds to click on reply and say, yes, I'd be delighted. When they said, would I do Berlin? I instantly replied, yes, I'll do Berlin. I'd always had this notion that I might write a book about Berlin in retirement, should that day ever come. And it's my, to use the German expression, it's my Lieblingsstadt, my favorite city in the world. Why? My mother was a refugee from Nazi Berlin, and she tried after the war to get back in touch with all her German friends to connect with the German past. And I grew up with this sense that Berlin was a truly ghastly, terrible, difficult city in ruins. My mother was shocked when she first went back there and saw how devastated it had been by the bombing. But also the notion that there was this mythical past, this sort of wonderful Berlin that there was always a yearning for. I'll return to that at the very end. Marlene Dietrich's song, I was just asked, did I want to play any music? And I would have loved to play Marlene Dietrich's song, Ich hab noch einen Koffer in Berlin. And the reason that you have to keep going back there in that song, it's got die Seligkeiten vergangener Zeiten, all the little treasures of past times that you can't quite recreate, you can't quite grasp, you can't quite get back to, but there's this yearning somehow for them. So I am, as I said to Rick in an email when he asked me any biographical details, I said, I'm a Wahl-Berlinerin, I'm a Berliner by choice. I love it. So it was a great pleasure to write this book. Mostly what I write about the whole of German history, and at the moment I'm writing about European history, about hiding from the Holocaust across Europe. And most of what I've been writing about in the last 10 or 15 years has been the Holocaust. So to write this book was just a really delightful escape, a hobby. I didn't feel like I was working. I felt like I was indulging in my free time and doing something fun and enjoyable. So what I'm going to do is talk you through very briefly, how do you write about 10 moments? Originally, it was going to be, the CUP notion was going to be 10 moments that 10 moments in a city, and then they changed that towards the end of my actually drafting the first draft, so it wouldn't be 10 moments in, but 10 moments that shaped. And so I had to suddenly insert a little vignette at the start of every chapter to sort of encapsulate. I don't write the kind of history that says this is the moment that shapes what comes next. You know, I don't necessarily believe in that kind of history, but I wanted to write vignettes that illustrated and illuminated and opened up a wider moment in the longer sense. I'm not going to take you through each moment, but I want to just pick out a few themes this evening. So I focused the book a bit around these notions of people, place, identity. What really struck me writing about Berlin is how much Berliners have always, since the earliest days, been immigrants from somewhere else. They're always waves of people coming in and they become Berliners. We'll talk a bit about how that happens. What does it mean to be a Berliner? This is not, thank goodness one might say, ethno-nationalism, nativism, sort of, you know, you belong there because your ancestors have lived there forever. This is becoming a member of a particular kind of society, a community, which it's very difficult to get the essence of. I've now got the screen so far away I can't read what my what I've put on the screen, but there are quirks about being a Berliner. I noticed this weirdly through my mother because she met up with all her classmates repeatedly. Every couple of years, they had what they called a Klassentag, and they met up with each other. And they all, despite being highly educated, professional women, most of them, went into a Berlinerisch, the quirks of a Berliner accent. I can't do it, I'm afraid. Those of you who know Berlin will know the quirks of speaking Berlinerisch, that you do a J instead of a G, so gut becomes gut, and ich becomes ich, and das becomes det. So I can't speak Berlinerish, but they love doing it just to show they're all part of a particular culture and a community, however scattered they were after the war. Other things I've noticed, particularly since I had to learn German as a second language at school arduously, which annoyed me. My mother didn't bring me up bilingual, which she could have done. But my father didn't speak German, so we spoke English at home. Another thing I noticed is that some of her upper class friends of that generation, and I've noticed it more broadly now, that generation, when they were not speaking Berlinerish, was speaking a sort of Frenchified German. So they would say, ah, pardon, instead of Entschuldigung, or what Berliners say now is sorry if they bump into you on the U-Bahn. So pardon has disappeared with that generation, but there was a sort of trace of the Berlin French influence, which I'll come on to. The other thing that really struck me writing about this is how radical the transformations were. So no gradualism about German history and no gradualism about Berlin history, repeated radical transformations of regime. And so this repeated sense that you're creating something new and you're either obliterating the old, consigning it to oblivion, or you're trying to in some way pluck out and preserve traces of the past that you want to preserve and highlight while marginalizing others. And you see that again and again and again. And that's affected the Berlin landscape massively. Origins and founding moments, I found this really problematic because like everywhere, it's lost in the mists of time. Many, many myths. So my founding moment that shaped Berlin in the first chapter, I said 3 myths and didn't choose between them. But I've highlighted for you here in the middle, Albert the Bear, who was a military hero of the Middle Ages. And some people say that's where the word Berlin came from, and that's where the Berlin bear, the symbol of Berlin, came from. A really scary looking bear in the Middle Ages, but a much, as we'll see, tubbier and pleasanter bear nowadays in the symbol all around the city. On the left there, I've indicated with a map from 1600, in fact, how tiny Berlin was. It was just 2 little fishing villages on either side of a bit of muddy water in swampy territory, pretty useless for everything. So you would not think that in those origins you would get to the Berlin of today. The other thing which I really noticed about the medieval and early modern period is already the multiculturalism. I've given you a rather gory picture on the right from 1510, which was when Berlin decided to expel its then quite thriving, though small, Jewish community. And in order to expel them, it first of all burnt, I think, 40 or so on a stake. You will know, those of you who know Berlin, you'll know Alexanderplatz, and you'll know the lovely old Marienkirche there. And that picture is just outside the Marienkirche. It's allegedly the spot where they were burnt at stake. So that started, that expulsion, that medieval period. I would say nobody looking in at Berlin in those days would have thought, and I'm not going to go through the details of the construction of the notion of Köln and Berlin, the 2 fishing villages coming together and so on, but nobody would have thought from those unpromising swampy beginnings it would rise in the way it did. What you see, and this I've suggested as a sort of very long moment here. What you see is a radical transformation. The medieval fortress of Spandau, if any of you want to go out on the U7 westwards and get there, it's worth climbing up and looking at the view from the top. It's really beautiful. I have to say that's one of the reasons I so enjoyed writing this book, because I went all over the place and just looked at everything and found things that I hadn't done before. But what you have in the Middle Ages and the early modern period is militarism in terms of fortresses, not courtly culture. And the transformation combines the emergence of a courtly culture with continued militarism in a changed form. If we look at the population, around 1600, when good old Shakespeare was wandering around these parts here, London had a population of somewhere in the region of 300,000, and Berlin had a population of 10 to 12,000. This is pathetic. This is not Vienna, Paris, London. This is just a little meaningless place. You get the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648. Berlin is devastated. The contemporary sources from the time are full of horrific descriptions of burnt out houses, non-habitable houses, mud and slime, peasants starving, reports of cannibalism, which some historians say are just propaganda, others suggest might be true, but really devastated. So by the end of the 30 Years' War, again, you would think Berlin was absolutely nothing. 6,000 people, that's nothing. That's smaller than the faculty of which I was dean. You know, it's really tiny. Then you get this real transformation in the late 17th, 18th century, which is phenomenal. I often say to students, if you're in doubt about the name of a ruler, try Frederick William, or possibly William, because you've got a high statistical percentage chance of being right on that. And in the 20th century, if you're in doubt about a date, try November the 9th, because it pops up repeatedly. But anyway, we have a succession of Frederick Williams and Fredericks at this period. After the 30 Years' War, the great elector, who was a Frederick William, argued that they needed a standing army, and the local landed estates were so weakened that they couldn't really put up much of a fight. So very different from English history in the Civil War period, where Parliament refused to just raise money for a standing army and give the king more absolute power. This was the beginnings of absolutism in Germany in a way that it wasn't in England. His son, Elector Frederick III, did something very clever. He gets a bad press, actually, in some of the books you read about Berlin, but I actually think he did something very clever, which was he crowned himself king in Prussia and took on the royal title and transformed the court into what we think of as courtly culture, with sculptures and nice palace-type buildings rather than fortress-type buildings. Conspicuous consumption. His son is known as the Soldier King, and I've given you one of his large soldiers. It was always joked, there are endless jokes from Voltaire and so on onwards about this was an army with a country rather than a country with an army. He loved marching his tall soldiers up and down. There are all sorts of stories about if you were he sent round his agents into schools and educational institutions to look for particularly tall teenagers that he could grab and put into uniform. And so there are stories about when they knew an agent was coming into the school, all the big boys kind of shrunk down under the desk or hid under the desk or tried to make themselves look smaller so they wouldn't be mobilized for his army. But he built up this great set of tall soldiers, and it was his son, Frederick the Great, who made use of that and indulged. Frederick the Great is really interesting because he's a very ambiguous character in many ways. He went out and used his military might in order to expand the power of Prussia, to expand the territories of Prussia, to make it into a larger and larger so-called composite state. This is not yet a nation state, it's not nationalism, it's a composite state, but it spreads right across from East Prussia right to the west to the Rhineland, different territories dotted about, very, very important in state building. And at the same time, Fred the Great was a flute player who loved music, who founded all sorts of cultural institutions. If you wander down Unterding Linden and you look at the opera and the library and so on in that central area, it's really Frederick the Great that's behind all that. So the really central core of Berlin has a lot to thank him for. So 18th century absolutism and enlightenment, this is this weird nexus of things going on in many German states at the time, not all by any means. One of my books, I was looking at Prussia versus Württemberg versus England, and Württemberg was quite different, Duchy of Württemberg. But in Prussia, what you have this combination of militarism on the one hand and absolutist rule, so the ruler can really do things without worrying about any backwash or much backwash. You also have things which are interesting in terms of the quite different strand of developments. Religious toleration from the late 1680s maybe onwards, attracting in minorities, religious minorities from other countries who are seen to be potentially economically useful. So particularly the French Huguenots, who were booted out of France after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. Excuse my French accent, it's even worse than my German, but I hope you know what I'm referring to. And Jews. So he's bringing in minority religions, minority groups who he thinks will be economically productive, and they are, and they really affect the nature of Berlin society. The French Huguenots, what you've got in the bottom left picture is the French cathedral in Gendarmenmarkt in Berlin. And if you think about even the word Gendarmenmarkt, why is it called that? It's the gendarmes, the men of arms who had their base there in that square. That's why it's Gendarmenmarkt. And the French cathedral is there because of them. They were given a lot more freedom and leeway than the Jews, who at that time couldn't build synagogues. It took quite a while before the Jews became more integrated into Berlin society. But Moses Mendelssohn, I actually begin my chapter with my moment when I'm getting there about Moses Mendelssohn arriving in the gate reserved for pigs and Jews, so it was said, penniless, but really incredibly important in terms of the Enlightenment and the development of emancipation and all sorts of things that I won't go into. So Frederick II is really important, Fred the Great. And they used to be on little stalls in Berlin, lots of little tiny china busts of him. I don't know if it's china or not, but little busts of Frederick the Great everywhere. He was sort of iconic, and there are still many statues of him all over the place when you walk around and look for it. Then we get into the 19th century, the Napoleonic era. So this incredibly lucky succession of 4 male heirs, the Frederick Williams and Fredericks, which have gone on for a century or so, comes to an end. We have a succession of weaker rulers. I won't go into details. Napoleon enters through the recently erected and very iconic Brandenburg Gate. And those of you who know it will know about the famous quadriga on the top of the gate. Napoleon takes it back as his prize booty to Paris. And it's only several years later that the Germans get the quadriga back and stick it back on top of the gate. But this inaugurates an era of reform, and it also inaugurates in the early 19th century. And I'm skimming so rapidly and simplistically over things that I hope any specialists among you will forgive me for this, but I'm trying to give you the broad brush approach. What you get in the early 19th century is the rise of German nationalism, in the sense that Germans are a nation and they should have a state which corresponds to the boundaries of that nation. Of course, we know that is contested. It goes on being contested through the 19th century. Questions, should Austria, the German-speaking part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, be part of it or not? Should Austria dominate? Should Prussia dominate? A variety of wars that lead to unification under Prussian dominance eventually. in 1871. In the meantime, a failed liberal revolution. I won't go through all that, but it's a really, really interesting period for Berlin's history, because Berlin suddenly is much more important. It's the capital of the state that becomes the strongest state in the German states through that period. And it's an era of industrialization and particularly the development of transport links. So I've given you the Potsdamer Bahnhof there on the right-hand one. You will all know Potsdam Station in central Berlin if you've been there. Very difficult not to go through it. That was done in 1841, but the first train went from Berlin, that station, to Potsdam, hence it was called the Potsdamer Bahnhof, in 1838, to much consternation at the time. A lot of fear about traveling at such speed, and what was the point of being in Potsdam a couple of hours earlier than if you went by horseback? So it was fearful new technology. I imagine they must have felt a bit like I feel about let's say, why are the Americans spending so much money on space rockets? Who wants to go to the moon? But Potsdam was a bit nearer and a bit nicer, and it had Sanssouci and other pleasant places that Frederick the Great had built up and enjoyed. So anyway, the development of transport links, the development of rail links is incredibly important. At the same time, the development of the bourgeoisie is really important. There's the growth of reading public, so reading literary bourgeoisie in the 18th century. The plate I've given you in the middle is of a house on Unterdale and Linden, which was a place where a salon was held by a Jewish female intellectual in the 1850s still, which is continuing in a tradition that started in the 1780s, 1790s, intellectual Jewish women holding little groupings to discuss matters of the day, with men coming in as well, often forging strong friendships. People like Heinrich Heine dropped in, others who were around. But women who were excluded from holding positions in university life or political life, and who were yet deeply engaged in what was going on and what was being published, and wanted to discuss books they were reading, ideas that were floating around, political developments. And I think this is just a really fabulous phenomenon that starts in the later 18th century, goes right through to the end of the 19th century, and in my view, plays into some of the intellectual sparkiness and acerbic wit that you can still see through the 20th century, certainly in the early 20th century. So I've given you that particular plate, which was on a piece of porcelain that was founded really the Königliche the royal porcelain manufacture started by Frederick the Great. A bit more going on in the 19th century, so I've stuck a shade too many things into that slide for me to read, certainly. You can probably see it better up there. Yeah.
You click on that OK button.
Sorry?
You click on that OK button to dismiss it.
Yeah, okay.
I need to click on OK, but I can't see it on here. I haven't got the OK up here. It's not on my screen. It's showing on that one, but not here.
You just have to move to the other screen.
Okay, you can do it on there, can you?
There we go.
Okay, brilliant, super. Okay, so this incredible population growth, I left you with 6,000 odd Berliners in 1638, 6,000 souls. By 1800, we've got 170,000, including 19,000 soldiers, so very much a garrison town. And then it grows and it grows and it grows because it's industrialization. So major new manufacturing businesses in Berlin, people coming in, workers coming in from the provinces, workers coming in from Poland, workers coming in from all over the place. So this incredibly rapid population growth. And I want to read out those bits. Let me see if I can read it on this. Okay, so you can probably read it up there anyway. I find these travellers quotes so interesting. Friedrich von Köln, the traveller is greeted by a frightful stink. After he's been talking about how beautiful the turrets are from a distance, and as you're walking nearer, and they all ham up the sandy nature of the soil and the waves of sand or the mud or whatever it might be, and then you're greeted by a frightful stink. And then Per Atterbom, sorry, who was a Swedish traveller, saying it's just all laid out military lines, which it was. The actual topography of Berlin is very militarized. It's all like barracks, he said. And then everywhere there were soldiers marching up and down. What really struck me as interesting when I was reading that kind of social history was trying to think about the streets that we know today in light of what is said about them then. Leipziger Straße, which many of you may know, if you go to Potsdamer Platz and you go to the big shopping centre there, and you go east along Leipziger Straße, it's just a main commercial thoroughfare. That used to be where many of the bourgeoisie lived at that time, and it had little runnels along the side of the pavement. And in the more upper class houses, they had someone come in every night to collect the pails of human waste that had been produced by the inhabitants during the day, and then take them out and put them on carts and trek them out to the country where they were dumped onto the farmers' fields as fertilizer, basically. But if you lived in the poorer houses, you just did your business and slopped it into the runnels along the edge of the pavement. And so again, travellers talk about this dreadful stink. It's really interesting, the development of just basic sanitation in the mid and later 19th century. Up the top there, I've given you a waterworks tower in Prenzlauer Berg, which was, I think, opened in something like 1872 and was still in use to purify water from the Spree until 1952, when finally they had better water sanitation mechanisms. The other thing that's going on is Berlin is expanding and expanding and expanding. So for most of the period up to now, it's just been that little old core centre, but now it's expanding outwards. So the upper bourgeoisie were living on Unter den Linden, then they were living on Leipziger Straße, then they started building around Tiergarten and Potsdamer Platz and that area, and then they start building further out. Property developers start developing whole sections of the city, buying up agricultural land and building bourgeois houses. In the meantime, there's this worry about where all the working class is going to live. And there is this so-called Hobrecht plan, which is to build those of you who've been to Berlin will know these well, the Mietskaserne, and these big building blocks, these big areas of apartment houses where you go through one courtyard after another courtyard after another courtyard until you get to the Innenhof where the sun never shines. And those of you who know Heinrich Ziller, who was this brilliant sort of cartoonist and observer of Berlin working class life at the turn of the century, he has some lovely sketches of little kids playing in the Innenhof, where lots of little children are playing there, and Mama is looking out of the window high up on the 5th floor or whatever, and one little kid is holding up a baby and saying, Mutti, Fritzi is Jansnass, with a J, of course, Jans, not Guns, Gansnass. What shall I do? Fritzi is I assume all of you talk German, yeah? Yeah. He's totally wet. What shall I do? And Mutti says, we'll hold him in the sun, dette trocknet, so that he will dry. Hold him in desert, dette trocknet. But of course, no sun ever gets down there. So these are these sort of Mietskaserne barracks, which are now very sought after to live in, and you can pay a lot to buy an apartment in one of those large old apartment blocks. So that's the sort of growth of Berlin. You can see it in this way, and it's taking over former suburbs, former villages, former agricultural areas. It's incorporating them until 1920, when they create Greater Berlin by formally incorporating an awful lot of them. So the growth is phenomenal to 4 million people. Imperial and modern metropolis. I'm squishing together an awful lot here, like throughout, actually. But I just wanted to highlight a few things with the images here. The growth of transport links, the S-Bahn and the U-Bahn, all the things we take for granted now. This is all late 19th century, early 20th century. Imperialism, the desire for colonies, this great colonial exhibition that I've given you a postcard from on the top left there. That's Potsdamer Platz, the bottom left, with the first traffic lights in Europe, which I love, and you can still see it in Potsdamer Platz, that thing, that structure standing up in the middle. The first time they thought we shouldn't have just a man standing there putting up his arms and going like this the whole time, but actually you can have red, orange and green lights to start and stop the traffic. And the two pictures on the right are other elements I wanted to highlight about this period. The beautiful old swimming pool in Charlottenburg on the bottom right, it's absolutely charming and it's still in use. The notion in the late 19th century that you need public baths for public health, with all these people living in unsanitary housing without indoor bathrooms or toilets and so on, should be able to go to a pool, be issued with a towel and have a wash. But also then suddenly this notion of health, and they should be able to swim laps, and there's enjoyment and leisure and pleasure in it. The 1920s, the top right picture is just a tiny bit of what you can find many of in Berlin, namely social housing built in the 1920s, designed by world famous architects. I find this just phenomenal that you get these incredibly famous architects building essentially council flats and saying they should have balconies, they should have access to green spaces, they should have a nice park nearby. There are several of these. That's taken from Siemensstadt, but there are others around Berlin, the Hufeisensiedlung, for example, further to the southwest. So there is this incredible modernity in the late 19th, early 20th century. First World War, slight problem, humiliating defeat, Treaty of Versailles. I don't need to go into the consequences of that for you. That's very well-known general history. But there is a sort of continuity of the social divisions that you can see already in the pre-First World War period, which then become exacerbated in the post-war conditions of the 1920s. So we unfortunately get into the way in which Hitler transformed and nearly destroyed Berlin. I've given you some pictures here which are not perhaps the most obvious ones. The second one from the left is this incredibly weird structure, a heavy, it's just called something like the Schwerbelastungskörper. I can't remember what name they gave it, but built by Albert Speer, because he had this design for transforming Berlin according to Hitler's plans, with a triumphal arch, which should be bigger even than any arch ever anywhere. I mean, Hitler, I don't want to make any contemporary references to American politics, but the notion of megalomania comes to mind. And Hitler wanted the biggest arch ever and the most grandiose buildings ever and the most... So he had Speer just destroy great tracts of Berlin. And then, because Berlin is built on swampy ground and everything sinks into the swampy wet ground, Speer built this very heavy structure just to see how much that weight it would bear, how much it would sink by, and that heavy structure is still sitting there as a sort of last remnant of Speer's and Hitler's crazy plans. On the left, this is the one that really tickled me. As you go around Berlin, you think you know where you can see the signs of Nazism. You go to the Olympiastadion, again, you know, grandiose, and I found it really unheimlich, if I can use the German word, to go swimming in the swimming pool in the Olympiastadion. I felt really creepy about this. It felt strange, but it's still in use. It's still, you know, a big sports area. You know about all that. What you don't notice is little fellows like the guy on the left there. That is in a housing estate on Grazer Damm, southern tip of Schöneberg. And it's a Hitler Youth relief that was carved into the wall above the entrance, the stairwell, in that, and all the way along that housing estate, every stairwell has a little relief carved into the wall, and nobody seems to have noticed that this was part of the Nazi building program for the new Volksgemeinschaft, the new comrades of the Nazi society. Similarly, the third picture along, the third from the left, second from the right, is in that gorgeous little Waldsiedlung, as it's now seen, which used to be an SS community next to Krummelanke. If any of you go to Schlachtensee, Krummelanke, for a nice little walk around in the sunshine in the woods, just walk through that housing estate. It was built specifically to give a sense of community to people working in the SS, including some quite notorious and disagreeable people. And it was built with these dinky little quasi toy town, quasi southwestern German housing, the architectural style, you can see it there, with nice big standalone houses for the Bonzen, the top brass of the SS, and little not detached houses, terraced houses. It sounds wrong for them. Terraced houses conveys something else to me, but you know, houses for the less important people along the way like that, and gardens which had no fences or hedges between them, because the idea was to foster this sense of community and everyone would play together. And it's a beautiful little Waldsiedlung now, and people are living in these houses. And again, I have this slight feeling of, is it just not a little bit unheimlich to live in a house that was built for a member of the SS and was lived in by somebody who's involved in unspeakable crimes at whatever level they were in the hierarchy? On the right, I've given you something else which you don't see much of, but it's one of the slave labour barracks. All across Berlin, foreign forced and slave labourers were housed in varying degrees of discomfort and difficulty in order to undertake effectively slave labour for the Reich when the men were away fighting and dying at the front. And that's one of the few last remaining ones that hasn't been repurposed or destroyed, and it's now part of the wider museum landscape of Berlin, opening up its Nazi past. But the major change in terms of the population of Berlin, I hardly need mention it, is the destruction of the Jewish community. Since Moses Mendelssohn, through the 19th century, through those intellectual salons and other prominent activities, the Berlin Jewish community has been growing in strength, in integration. Many Jews converted to Lutheranism, for example. Many intermarried. It was a very, very assimilated community in Berlin, and that was nearly completely destroyed by Hitler, whether people went west and got out, or whether they were deported east and murdered. And at the end of the war, maybe 5,000 Jews had tried to go into hiding in Berlin, maybe 1,500 survived in hiding in Berlin, out of a much, much bigger population, maybe 150,000 before. So that is a massive transformation of Berlin society, this multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious society Hitler sought to transform into something much more homogeneous, according to his notion of the pure Aryan race and so on. So post-war, I mean, Hitler brought the war about. It destroyed much of Berlin. The ruins were shattering. The uncertainties about what to do with it afterwards were great. In the West, I've given you the Kaiser Wilhelm Gedächtniskirche there, which many of you will know. The decision was made to preserve it as a ruin, a memorial, to remind people of what had happened. In the middle, I've given you Stalin on Unter den Linden to remind you that the imposition of Stalinism happened bang over the center of Berlin. I mean, they got all the best bits in a way, the East Germans. The wall went round the Brandenburg Gate, and the main central old area was within Berlin, capital of the GDR, as they like to repeatedly call it. And in the Tiergarten, I find that really interesting. There was a Russian tank left there in front of the ruins of the Reichstag, which is still there. That had to be preserved as a sort of monument in memory of the Red Army soldiers who helped to liberate Berlin. But the question is then, what does Berlin become? The construction of new identities with the wall in between, that is so well known. I'm just mentioning very briefly here two aspects that I try and bring out in the book a bit. Marzahn is the big picture of the housing estate there. Marzahn is something that's not much written about in histories of the GDR or East Berlin or East Germany, in terms of the visionary aspect of constructing modern housing with indoor sanitation, where people would have a bathroom and a toilet and central heating. It was much sought after among East Germans at the time, pre-1989 this is, as being really modern and not crumbling and falling apart and falling into the street like many of the old Prenzlauer Berg older buildings were. And it had community centres. It had quite visionary architectural ideas in terms of having a community centre, a sports facility, places where people could gather. When I went around Marzahn trying to understand this and understand the architects who were behind it, I was quite shocked that post-unification, while they kept the apartment houses, that got rid of all the aspects of community centres, cinemas, sports facilities, and just made it a dump, basically, for poor people to pay lower rents. What I also was fascinated by was Alt-Marzahn, a little street that still had an ancient church in the middle of the street and a sort of almost a farm-like quality to it. Really extraordinary. So that's worth, trekking out from the old tourist tracks in the centre of Berlin to see. On the bottom right, you see a photograph of what was the Palace of the Republic, Palast der Republik, now replaced by the Humboldt Forum, which has reconstructed. And this is such an example of what I mean about Berlin constantly under reconstruction. The old Hohenzollern Palace was destroyed and torn down by the communists in the GDR. They built on its grounds this Palace of the Republic, which is on the right of that photo, bottom right. And then in the 1990s and 2000s, and much controversy about, do we destroy that, tear it down? It had asbestos in, it would have cost a lot to sanitize it, but it could have been done. Or do we try and preserve it? And in the end, the decision was taken, no, we'll reconstruct the facade on three sides of the old Hohenzollern Palace, but do this in the modern, ironic way where we show it's just the facades reconstructing it, and one side is absolute modern, not the old, and now it's the beautiful facsimile, if you like, of the old Hohenzollern Palace. But that's what it looked like in 1981. The old Palace of the Republic, or as the East Germans often called it, not the Palast der Republik, but the Ballast der Republik, the ballast of the Republic, which is one of many East German jokes. Since 1990, very, very briefly, debates over what you do with the traces of the GDR. I've just talked about the Humboldt Forum as one of them. Nearly total imposition of Western structures and institutions, apart from the Ampelmann, who I've given you on the top left there, the little green man to tell you to cross the road. The West German one is a sort of nasty stick man. And the East German one was this rather cozy little chap with his hat on going for a walk, the East German Ampelmännchen. So he's got put on all the traffic lights, or most of them in West Berlin now, and has become sort of a symbol. But this is part of this nostalgia, this nostalgia for the lost East and for the cozy parts of it, the sort of community sense of belonging parts of it. The top right there is Norman Foster's new glass see-through dome on top of the Reichstag to replace the ruined dome, and you can see people walking up it in there. And the bottom left photo I really like, because it shows again this layering, the traces. It's under the glass are the remains of the Gestapo cellars in the former Reichssicherheitshauptamt, the RSHA, the headquarters of the SS and the repressive apparatus in Prince Albrechtstraße. And that was just a wasteland right up until 1987, when they started digging because they were going to construct something new and nasty on it, and found these cellars still there. And there was a massive campaign to say, we must preserve the traces of Nazi persecution. It was highly contested at the time, then the wall fell, and then now we have the topography of terror there. So it's a story in itself, but it's hard up against the wall, much of it preserved right there, so you can see the wall in that picture, and right behind it is Goering's air ministry. So this incredible juxtaposition of historical layers there I find really fascinating, and you hit that everywhere you go in Berlin, this layering and confrontations that actually either make you personally think, what is this Hitler Youth doing on the side of an apartment block, or make you think, why have they chosen to display this and not highlight that? The Politburo headquarters, for example, was just repurposed for the finance ministry, no, not the finance ministry, the foreign ministry of Germany. There's no plaque on it saying this is actually where the seat of power was, not the Palast der Republik, but the Politburo, and the Stasi. Mielke had a little office in there as well, although it wasn't the main Stasi headquarters. But Stasi headquarters have become, opened up for tourism. But the Politburo headquarters, they've just reused as the Foreign Office building. So sometimes I go around Berlin wondering why they've preserved something and why they've displayed it and what they're doing with it. And sometimes I go around saying, I know this was here then because I've got the map which shows it. Why have they not made that clear? I know something happened here, but nobody's saying something happened here. So it's really fascinating that. So let me come towards an end. I started with Marlene Dietrich and Ich habe noch einen Kaffee in Berlin. I think, there is no essence of Berlin because it's perpetually changing, and it's changing so radically with every regime transformation. It's constantly trying to do something completely new. But it seems to me one of the essences of Berlin is this multiple layering. The Glienicke Bridge I've put in the middle there, which famous spy swaps, and you see it in films all the time, and it's always in spy novels, terribly famous, and yet you walk over it now and next to nothing is made of it. I first cycled over it many years ago when it was first opened, and I was staying in West Berlin, and I was going over to Potsdam to do research in an East German archive, which is in Potsdam, and I could not believe I was cycling across the Glienicke Brücke. There was a sort of, a real shudder about it. Now it's just become any old bridge that you might cross or not, depending on if it's convenient or not. Everywhere in Berlin, you will see the Stolpersteine, like that bunch on the left. And on the right, I've put a picture which I always find, I find that location amazing for several reasons. It's an old bunker, which nobody thought to pull down because it was too complicated to pull down a bunker. So they built the block of flats over the top of it. This is in Schöneberg, which I just find incredible. How can you live on a block of flats on top of a bunker? And next to it is, you can't see much of it, but you can see the corner, the side of the school that my mother went to, which is why I'm particularly fond of that corner. And her school also encapsulates much about history. It was originally called the Kaiserin Augusta Schule, the Empress Augusta Schule. Then in the Weimar Republic, they didn't like the Empress bit, so they just called it the Augusta Schule. And then in the 1950s, they renamed it, the very first school in Germany to be renamed after Sophie Scholl of the White Rose. So it became the Sophie Scholl Schule. And one of the teachers there objected vehemently and said, how can you rename the school after somebody who was a traitor? She was a traitor to her fatherland, Sophie Scholl. He was very angry. And this was one of my mother's teachers who was being very angry. And the school wanted to sack him. They wanted to fire him for making this protest. And my mother, who was then living in South Wales in the constituency where Jim Callaghan was MP, the later Prime Minister Jim Callaghan, but at that time just MP, she got Jim Callaghan to write to say, look, in a democracy, we don't agree with what everybody else thinks, and we disagree totally with the notion that Sophie Scholl was a traitor rather than a wonderful woman who gave her life to a noble attempt to get rid of Hitler. But this teacher should not lose his job over having a different view. So he was reinstated and allowed to stay. So I find the history of that school really fascinating because it encapsulates so much of the much wider German history and the issue about how do you learn democracy and how do you learn to disagree with each other within the same framework. So let me come to an end. Thank you for your attention. That's the Berlin Bear today on Today in Linden, looking very friendly. Thank you. And I'm happy to take questions and discussion.
Thank you very much, Mary, for making light of a very difficult task, squishing 1,000 years of history into 50 minutes of an entertaining, a light, a fascinating, and a very enthralling talk. So thank you very much. And I'm sure there are questions. So if you would like to raise a hand, we've got a roving mic here now. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I just want to make a very quick observation. Yes.
Imo.
Two things. One is that bomb shelter with the flats over it. When that was built, people were quite worried about possible Third World War, and they might have thought that keeping the bomb shelter might come in useful. The other thing is the Ampermännchen. Last year we were in Hanover, my wife and I, and we saw them there. So they're spreading all over Germany now.
They are much nicer than the stickmen.
Should be.
I just heard this amazing fact, quite relatively recently. You know, the sports palace, I'm not sure whether it is in Berlin, but you know, it was the scene of all the big Nazi party rallies in the latter years of the Weimar Republic, and maybe even in the initial year or so of the Third Reich. But I only found out recently that the sports palace was constructed as a Jewish monument. And so I thought, this is isn't it?
Yep. Port Plus doesn't exist anymore. Yeah, a lot of Berlin was this? Yeah, okay. Was built by different people, some of whom were Jewish, some of whom were not. So, you know, you find that everywhere. I don't find that so odd. I mean, it's ironic that Hitler gave horrible speeches in a building that was constructed by some Jewish entrepreneur, but I don't find that odd at all.
Well, the supplementary question is, was he aware of that?
Oh, that the question was Hitler aware of the fact that the Sportpalast apparently was built by a Jewish entrepreneur? And I don't know if he was aware or not.
It's not aware. It's just incidental.
Would you like to take a question online? Would you like to take a question?
There's a question online.
Yes, hello, Taylor. What is your question, Taylor?
We've got another question here in the hall. So let's hear that one, and if we get the online chat. Yes.
Interesting. If you're plotting or etc. with places like the property of town, with on the running. So with all memorials, just and the along the edge the into getting there's a whole bunch of memorials down the side of the Tiergarten. So if you want a concentrated centre of Berlin, Gate, Unter den Linden, Holocaust Memorial, Topography of Terror, I would suggest. If you're going to go out, then go to the House of the Wannsee conference, if they're doing A-level history on the shores of the Wannsee. Quite apart from anything else, it's lovely to walk around the Wannsee, and if they need a breather and see the lake and see some trees, that could be a welcome break. So many things that are possible.
That Holocaust Memorial, is that down in the
No, you're thinking of the Jewish Museum. Yeah.
Sorry about that. Questions?
Yes, sir.
No.
Short question. Will you talk pretty much representation of the book, or do you cover other instances holding on individuals in the book?
In 50 minutes, I couldn't tell you everything that's in the book. No. So there's a lot more stuff in the book than in my talk.
That was one managed to, as you said, compress from essentially into 50 minutes. It was very strong to do. I suppose before coming tonight, I was thinking that the talk might be, and this is nowhere Christian at all, but
a little bit more what, sorry?
I had thought in my own mind that it's my responsibility to think that, not a criticism of talk, but that there would be more discussion of individuals, for instance, of Rosa Luxemburg or many other things.
Okay, so the question, I don't know if everyone heard that, but more individuals. Rosa Luxemburg was given as one of the questions. Yes, she is in fact the moment that I start one of my chapters with, Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. I start the chapter with their assassination and being, in her case, thrown into the water. And Liebknecht, I mean, what I try to do with the vignettes is to bring individuals to the fore, to highlight individuals, and Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht start a chapter as the vignette. The vignette I start the Third Reich chapter with is an extract from the diary of a woman called Ruth Andreas Friedrich, who was a journalist, and how she's looking out of the window and seeing Jews being dumped onto a truck, and she's ruminating into her diary, what can we do? They have weapons, we don't, and besides, if we shot them, we'd be as bad as the Nazis. There's nothing we can do. And meanwhile, she's trying to hide Jews in her flat. So I try to start each chapter with individual insights and bring it home that people were living there, and this is what it was like for them. And then in the course of the chapter, I do obviously have to cover it, I have to talk about prominent individuals, because I hammed up the Fredericks and the Frederick Williams today because they made such a difference in the late 17th, 18th century to Berlin's history, but there are many others who make a big difference. So, I mention them where they're significant, but it's not a book that is that kind of history. There are other Berlin histories which do that. There are other Berlin histories which are much more straight political histories. And what I was really trying to get at was the expansion of the place, the social history, the topographical expansion, and the reconstruction of identity, which seemed to me something that don't come across in other books that are histories of Berlin. I mean, there's Alexandra Ritchie's very, very dense, long book about Berlin, for example, which takes a quite different approach. So the book itself is quite short, actually, as books go. And I'm just trying to encapsulate, I'm trying to focus on the notion of Berlin as a city growing over the centuries.
Thank you very much. Okay, we've got time for just two more questions, one at the back and then you, sir.
Pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer was pastor here for a while. He was imprisoned in Charlottenburg prison. I can think of the palace there, but I don't think there's much remaining of the actual prison itself. A second question, on a lighter note, that it's nice to see you portray the Ample Man, which I always think it's a lovely story of the survival of something in East Berlin, which I gather was based on Erich Honecker. Was it a figure or was that just a myth?
I wouldn't have thought it was based on Erich Honecker, actually, and the ample mention is so lieblich and sort of, it always reminds me of that nursery rhyme, Hänschen klein Ginkerlein in die weite Welt hinein, Stock und Hut steht im Gut, bis voll zumut. I don't know how many Germans here sang that. That was one thing my mother did sing to me in German when I was little. And he looks to me like that, Stock und Hut steht im Gut. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, yeah. There are places where he's memorialized in Berlin. The Zionskirche, which I nearly showed you a photograph of in East Berlin, is a really quite important church for the East German peace movement and environmentalist movement in the 1980s, where they had this unofficial Umweltbibliothek, environmental library in the basement of the Zionskirche. And that was where Bonhoeffer was active for quite a while. And they've got a huge sort of cutout figure of him, or did when I last went by there. So yeah, he is visible in the Berlin memorial landscape.
Two questions. First one, what is the first book that you wrote about? And secondly, you kind of just answered that question because you talked about the Zionskirche in East Berlin. I was wondering, the daughter of a Gesamtberliner who is now coming to Gesamtberlin, how much do you still see? You know, we know where the war was and stuff. How much do you see Berlin? And how much do you still see West and East Berlin?
Okay, I said East Berlin about the Zionskirche because it was East Berlin then. I'm thinking of the 1987 raid on the Umweltbibliothek. In the autumn of 1987, a marvelous story about that. They're collecting all this literature about environmental damage in East Germany. They're, building up this little library. The Stasi decide they're going to arrest them. The Stasi work out a very special tactic. They decide they need incriminating material on the premises when they go to do the arrest. So they get their car full of incriminating material in the boot, which they're going to plant in the Umweltbibliothek when they arrive, and then they can arrest everyone who's there. But this is such a lovely East German story. I mean, I love this story because it's so typical of so many things about the then GDR. The car breaks down on the way, and they don't get there in time to plant the incriminating material before the arrests are being carried out. It's just wonderful. So anyway, so the Zionskirche was in East Berlin at the time that I was referring to. How far do I see East and West still today? I see it a lot, actually. If you get a tram in East Berlin, you notice that the tram suddenly stops because West Berlin, in its stupidity, I won't say in its wisdom, decided that it was going to concentrate on cars and roads and got rid of the tram system. So an awful lot of trams, unless they've now extended them, which a few have, an awful lot of tram lines just stop. So you've got this hidden wall still visible in the transport system. There is a theory that while Berlin used to be divided east-west, it's now divided in a donut shape. The people who can afford to live in the middle and the people who have to live on the outskirts. And so economically, it's becoming a Berliner in the sense of a donut, a jam donut, rather than being an east-west division. So How far do I feel like a Gesamtberlinerin? I don't. I have to say, I love Schöneberg. That's where my mother's school was. That's where I feel very at home. I discovered when I was there last May, I looked up the Berlin address book of 1932 and discovered my grandfather had lived just along the road from where we have a flat, which I never knew when we bought the flat, which is quite incredible. You know, so somehow I've come home and I've got this sense of reclamation, land reclamation in a way, oddly, that I'm sort of completing something from which my mother was cut off, that she would have loved to go on living there. And I'm sort of feel that in a second life, I'm continuing something that was truncated against her will. So I feel like a Wahlberlinerin, but very much only in the areas in which I feel at home and which I like. And there are areas of Berlin which I really do not like. And I went all around for writing this book, but there are areas where I feel very much less at home and wouldn't live.
But that makes you a Berliner.
Exactly.
And Keats,
Genau, Keats. Yeah, a Keatsian Keats. It's my Keats.
There are a couple of observations online. One is that the typefaces between East and West on street signs are still different in many cases. And there's one question about Frenkel, of the Frenkel Prize. Is he a Berlin Frenkel? The questioner, Manuela, says she's a daughter of a Nuremberg Fürst-Wien Frenkel and a Mainz Frankfurt Goldschmidt and Heinemann.
Okay, it was Ernst Frenkel who got very involved in the Wiener Library in London and founded this prize, I think in the 1990s. And his son still lives in London, but I don't know where Ernst Frenkel came from originally.
But
Yeah.
the clue might be in the name Wiener Library, right?
Oh, well, that was, yeah, we know who Wiener was, yes.
So I
He
think-
was a German
that was the
emigre
name.
who set up the library. Yeah.
Good. I think we should draw to a conclusion there. Thank you all very much for coming this evening. Thank you for your questions at the end there. Thank you for tuning in, those of you who are online. And thank you very much, Mary, for such a vivid, drawing a picture of such a wonderful city as Berlin is. Now, everybody here in the church is invited to a glass of wine and a piece of Stollen cake in the Metzold-Zimmer, which is the room at the back of the building. I hope, Mary, you'll come and join us there too. It just remains for me to say that in a month's time, every third Tuesday, we have a talk in this building. Actually, we don't have, in next month, it's not in this building, it's online only. A gentleman who's given a talk here before, Keith Hamnett, who lives in Liverpool, but he'll be talking to us about the relationship between Lutheranism and the Methodist Church. Keith Hamnett, incidentally, gave us a talk 2 years ago about the Stolpersteiner, which was the last on the last screen that Mary showed us, the brass plaques that are placed in front of people in all over Europe, actually, who were persecuted by the Nazi regime, and including one here in London as well. So that's in a month's time. And once again, thank you all very much for coming, and especially Mary, thank you for such a wonderful talk. So.
you